call. I will hand it over to Drew.
Sounds good. Thank you, Meredith. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting. We are doing a joint meeting with Atmospheres and Glaciers team. For those who have been on both Atmosphere and the Glacier team before, and who don't know who I am, I just recently joined. Just joined IARPC, the IARPC Secretariat on the Atmospheres, Marine Ecosystems, and Environmental Intelligence teams. I'm a Knaus Fellow, so I just started about 3 weeks ago. So I'm here to learn along with everyone else, and I'm helping get this meeting started for the first time. So welcome and thank you for your patience today. So I'm sure a lot of us have used Zoom before, but just some Zoom etiquette before we get started. There is a mute button in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Please, when people are presenting, please stay muted to prevent feedback. You can use the chat box throughout the call to ask questions, which speakers can get back to you later on, and you can also raise your hand to ask a question. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I'm missing, Meredith. Oh, roll call. So because there's 13 of us, we're not gonna waste too much time doing around the room to introduce people. So if you can, just go ahead in the chat box, introduce yourself and state your affiliation, and we will capture that in our meeting notes. And with that, has Barry showed up yet?
I think Jen is going to lead in.
Okay, sounds good. I'll hand it over.
Thanks. I wasn't sure if I was going first or is Caitlin introducing from the other side?
Sure, Jen, I can make a couple of comments to, kind of frame and share our motivation and thoughts, but you can lead off if you like.
Okay. Welcome everybody. So I am a co-team lead for the Atmosphere Collaboration Team with Heiss and Barry, and neither of them, Barry is supposed to be on the call. He'll probably be joining us here. And then Heiss, I think, had a conflict, so he's not here today. Some of you have seen us before, spoken with our group before. And as Drew was saying, this is a joint meeting between the Atmosphere Collaboration Team and the Glacier team, and we're really excited about that. It's always fun when we bring two groups together. So I'll just talk a little bit about IARPC and introducing IARPC to you guys. So IARPC, if you're not familiar with IARPC or you've heard this before, it's always a good refresher. It is for me. IARPC actually exists within the Executive Office of the President to coordinate the U.S. federal agency efforts under the Arctic Research and Policy Act. You're probably familiar with the current Arctic Research Plan that ran from 2017 and will end this year in 2021. And then there are a lot of current efforts, which many people have been involved in, to develop the next 5-year plan. So the current plan has 4 policy drivers related to Earth systems, Arctic resident health and well-being, environmental stewardship, and national security, and 9 collaboration teams that cover a range of topical interests, including the Atmosphere Collaboration Team and the Glacier team. And so through IARPC collaborations, IARPC brings together U.S. federal agencies with university, industry, and international partners to accelerate progress toward research objectives in the Arctic Research Plan. Our collaboration teams hold regular meetings focused on themes relating to the research objectives and the associated performance elements under each of those objectives. So if you are new to IARPC, I'm guessing nobody here is new, but if you are new, we do recommend that you would establish an account on the IARPC Collaboration's website. It's really helpful. You're probably all on there by now, if not. Let's see, what else do I want to say here? Let's see. I don't know, in here, Hazel and Meredith, are we also talking now about the code of conduct in our introduction? Sorry, I'm sort of going off script, but I'm just curious.
Sure, yes, thanks for bringing that up, Jen. IARPC is in the process of developing a code of conduct or updating our code of conduct. And so that was put out kind of for public review and is currently being updated right now. But in the meantime, we are hoping to create an open space where people can feel welcome to share their points of view in a respectful way. And if you feel like IARPC isn't creating this type of open space for sharing, or you have any issues, please reach out to a member of the Secretariat and we will follow up and help to address that.
Thanks, Meredith. So just a couple more things to introduce IARPC. So there are about 1,000 members in IARPC collaborations, and you're probably part of that network. Our collaboration teams do benefit from the collective input of all the team members. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. Your active participation allows all of us to identify synergies, develop partnerships with other researchers and organizations, and you're highlighting your research that's visible to federal agencies such as the one that I work for and or Congress. And it allows you to communicate with federal program managers. So I know that's something that, for example, Barry and Caitlin and I have all talked about in terms of being federal facilitators of research or conducting research. This is a really important forum from that perspective. And Meredith talked about the code of conduct. So we request that all meeting participants are here with an open mind, be respectful of the diverse perspectives represented in the call. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Caitlin, to add anything you'd like to from your team.
Yeah, thanks everybody for the lead in. I think that's pretty comprehensive. I'll just mention really quickly that I'm Caitlin Florentine. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and I am the co-lead of the Glaciers and Sea Level Collaboration Team for IARPC with Joe McGregor, who works with NASA, and he's currently out because he has a small new baby at home. So we're pretty excited about that. And Murat and Jeff, it's really nice to meet you, two of our speakers today. And Max, nice to see your face there. Looking forward to diving in. This joint meeting is motivated by a desire to break down traditional silos, traditional disciplinary silos, and start to talk about, I think we're going to really focus on kind of the, I guess we'll see where we go with the ice core from the top down, basically from the atmosphere all the way to interpreting what's been trapped there to get a record of the past. So with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker and we'll get to some science.
And actually, just before you start, I want to say, well, oftentimes we only have, 15 to 20 or 30 participants on the call. These presentations or meetings are recorded and then posted to the IARPC website, and they're often viewed many times after our initial call. So people who can't be here today will log in and watch your presentations and stuff. So while you have a small audience here, keep in mind that it'll probably be viewed many more times over going into the future. And so who is our first? I have the agenda right here. Wait, right here. Do we have an order? Are we having Jeff speak first?
Starting, Jen.
Okay, well then, Jeff Welker, please introduce yourself and kick us off.
Okay, let's see. I'll share my screen. I'm Jeff Welker, and I'm at the University of Alaska Anchorage. I also have a joint appointment with the University of Oulu in Finland. And so I spend a bit of time in both locations. I wanted to share with you today, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this, some of the water vapor isotope work that we've been doing out of Thule in Northwest Greenland. And my collaborators have been tremendously instrumental in allowing this to happen. Ben, Eric, and Pete, and several others who have been part of our program. As we're all aware, Greenland is exceedingly interesting to all of us, is a place of change, constantly in the news. This is a cover article that Joe led that some of you may have recently seen, which he was able to share with us the banding of ice along the Ingefield land area in Northwest Greenland, showing the youngest ice on the surface and the oldest ice as you get closer to the land surface there to the left. The Arctic today is tremendously different than the Arctic of the past. Franklin and his group encountered ice year-long for many years there. The Greeley expedition experienced some of that as well. But today it's a system that's changing dramatically in terms of the perennial sea ice pack and its distribution and its motion. We heard about this recently, the motion of ice in the Arctic and the extent to which the multi-year ice is really only going to be found north of Greenland and into parts of northern Ellesmere Island. And this has meant that we've all taken a real interest in the Arctic hydrologic cycle, and especially the interactions between the cryosphere, the ocean, and atmospheric transport characteristics. In our work that I'll talk a bit about today, we'll address really how the interactions between the hydroclimate, the cryosphere, and the ocean are manifested in water isotopes. And we're particularly interested in the water isotope characteristics because there's many venues in which they can tell us about. Water isotopes can reflect atmospheric transport processes. They can reflect sea ice conditions. They can also be influenced by ocean currents. They're also tremendously valuable as we look to the past. And so this is where this group and the discussions between the atmosphere group and the glacier ice group are important, because it's understanding these modern processes that allow us to look to the past and really resolve what those climates were like. And these modern water isotopes are also especially important as we calibrate GCMs, which really are the essence of making predictions and accurate forecasts. Our work has been based out of Thule, again in the northwest corner of Greenland. This is a location that was used originally for the very first ice core at Camp Century. Some of you may have even been up to the ice ramp there at Camp Tudo. If you were at that ice ramp 20 years ago when we first started up there, you could walk all the way to the end of it. Today, it's been completely broken as the ice along the margin has receded. And so the ice ramp is really no longer there. We've had the good fortune of being and working at Thule since about 2003 as part of several programs. One of those, which really kicked off our work there, was biocomplexity. We've also had support through the Arctic Observing Network as part of the ITEX program, then also as part of Mosaic. Over the years, I'd say we've mentored maybe 100 different individuals on our research projects up there that have included pattern groundwork. You see Ron and Bernard there, as well as teams that have been there as part of summer field courses. One of the advantages of Thule in terms of a research base of operations for our work is it allows continuous operations and support from the U.S. Air Force. Some of you may know that the U.S. built air bases both at Thule and Kangerlussuaq at the Cold War era, and so these sites have provided almost continuous access for scientists, and again, have been really essential to our work up on the Greenland ice sheet and the ice coring program going back to Camp Century, but what we also have going at Neem and Summit and other locations now. What we started in 2007 was taking advantage of some new technology, and that is laser-based capacities to continuously measure the water vapor in air that is drawn in and run through an analyzer. This is the building up above the Thule Air Base. We've given our water vapor isotope system there the name of Gandalf because he measures something that only a wizard could measure, and that is it's invisible, it's water vapor. One of the things that we've been extremely fortunate to be able to do is to collect this continuous data. And as we all know, for so many of the data sets that we have today that tell us about climate and the Earth's atmosphere, continuous data, whether it's from Mauna Loa or many of these other sites with our weather stations throughout the world or our buoy systems, it's really this continuous data that allows us to capture events that we didn't expect, to look at very strong relationships that might exist, in this case, between water vapor isotopes, temperature, wind speed, wind direction, even longer term processes like the daily, monthly, and interannual variability in climate oscillations, be it the North Atlantic or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or the Arctic Oscillation. Thule, again, it's been time periods that we've been there. There have been a couple of real extreme events that we've been able to capture. That real super warming event that took place a couple of years ago when we had a big pulse of warm moisture made its way into the Arctic. We see big enrichments here in the middle of the graph to the right. I don't know if I can put my cursor on that, but the graph to the right is the 18.0 values. You can see that they're kind of chugging along, being pretty consistent, and then a big spike associated with the big flush of moist water coming up the Baffin Bay. Those are events that we've been able to measure and capture, which again have helped us understand the rapidity at which changes occur in the Arctic. Kyle's helped us understanding the role of atmospheric rivers and moisture transport into the Arctic. Again, Thule's able to capture those kind of events for us, which are occurring in many cases more frequently. And collectively, what we've been able to put together with the Thule program is really looking at how water vapor isotopes respond at different scales. So daily scales, synoptic scales, which are weekly and monthly, annual scales, and then interannual variability. And one of the things that we see, which we're quite excited about, is there appear to be some strong relationships between the water vapor and the different phases of the NAO. And so we've been able to really document this in a way that we haven't been able to understand the way that system influences moisture transport into, within, and out of the Arctic. The other thing that we've been focused on here in more recent times, as we've delved deeper and deeper into our time series, is really questions about the formation of sea ice and how sea ice is being reflected in the water vapor isotopes at Thule. And as an example, here are some images which are showing the west coast of Greenland up through Smith Sound there. We even heard about some of this just recently with the presentation on the breakup of the ice wall out of Nares Strait. So Nares Strait's just up to the left there in the corner. But what we begin to see is that with our high frequency measurements and our intense micrometeorological data collection, and then also what we get from satellites, is we can see that there are atmospheric wind events that really begin to influence the sea ice that is adjacent to Thule, which ends up being reflected in open water along the bay. And so we're able to actually detect that with Gandalf and very rapid changes as these sea ice conditions are changing in the spring, all through the Kennedy Channel, down through Smith Sound, and along the west coast of Greenland. Our work has also been part of Mosaic. And so we've been able to use Thule in a series of sites throughout the Arctic to really capture some of the transport processes. For instance, in the lower right-hand corner, as we have moisture that comes up out of Scandinavia across our site in Arctic Finland, passes by the polar stern sitting out there, and then gets ejected out of the Arctic through the Bering Strait that we capture with measurements at Barrow and Thule. And so this multi-site aspect is something that we're really pretty excited about, and we think it's bringing a very new perspective on the behavior of the Arctic and how the behavior is differing on the east, central, and western sides simultaneously. The other thing in terms of next steps is that we're beginning to use these very long detailed time series at different sites to compare the patterns and behaviors of the Arctic. And so on the left side here is a wavelet diagram, which really is depicting kind of the the behavior of the Arctic simultaneously between Thule and, in this case, where we ever have another very long record in Arctic Finland. And our next steps really our aspirations are really thinking more and more about comparative water vapor attributes across the Arctic, using both land and ship-based platforms. We've done a little bit of this with the Healy, and we see that as, and now with the Polar Stern. So we really see an opportunity to fully develop that, where we match up a lot of the ice-breaking capacity across the international community, and then apply those data to reanalysis of our ice core records, for instance, and also our GCM forecasting. So with that, I think I did it in less than 11 minutes. But anyway, thank you for the opportunity to talk this morning, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations.
Thanks, Jeff. Any questions? I'll say while we're waiting, you can put questions in the chat box, or you can just come off mute. It's a small enough group to ask questions, but I will say while we're waiting to field any questions here that what I really like about these, especially when we have 3 speakers, is that it ends up sort of being a mini workshop, even between the speakers and stuff, to talk through things. So feel free to come off and mute and or put questions in the chat box if you have any questions for Jeff at this time. We can also come back around to Jeff after we hear the other 2 speakers.
I'll be here.
Okay, perfect. And so our next speaker is Max Stevens. Max, do you want to introduce yourself at the start there?
Yeah, let me see if I can successfully share again here. Does that look like a title slide that you see?
It does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so hello, my name is Max Stevens, and I've recently started at the University of Maryland at the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center and the Cryosphere Lab at NASA Goddard, which means that at this point I'm primarily working on thinking about polar firn to help interpret altimetry measurements of the ice sheets. But I do have a bit of history in the ice core world. Throughout my PhD, I thought about Firn and ice cores, so I had to kind of rack my brain here. So we'll see how much I was able to successfully recall about work I've done in the past, but thanks very much for the introduction to talk today. And I think my main goal is to convince you that Firn is important, because that's pretty much what I've spent the last 10 years doing, because there's a lot of people who will tell you that Firn, that's just in the middle of the important stuff like the atmosphere and the ice. So we'll see how I do. So just to get us all on the same page, when I'm talking about Firn, I'm talking about the upper layer of an ice sheet or a glacier. So snow, which is pictured there on the left, falls on top of the glacier, and more snow falls on top of that and more on top of that, and it gets compacted and compacted more until it becomes glacial ice. And the other important thing to know for the sake of this talk is that we can get multiple kinds of climate records from ice cores. So the temperature record comes from the isotopic composition of the ice itself. So in your lab, you melt your ice core, throw away the air, and look at what the water isotopes in that melted ice are. And that's a proxy for the temperature when the snow fell. And on the other hand, the gas record comes from bubbles of air that are trapped within the ice. So there in the lab, you melt your ice core, throw away the water, and look at the gases. And I should say that the scientists aren't necessarily throwing away those things, and we can ask Murat what he does with his extras. But the great thing about the gas record is it really is a direct measurement of the atmosphere in the past. And an important thing to know for today is that Firn is a porous medium, by which I mean that it's a mixture of air and ice. So these images are micro CT scans of a Firn core from Summit, Greenland. And the white is the Firn and the black is the air. And you can see near the surface, there's quite a bit of pore space. And as you go deeper and deeper, there gets to be less and less pore space until at some depth, the pores are quite distinct from one another. That is, they're not connected anymore. So if we look at that in a cartoon here, we see in the red that as you go deeper and deeper in the Firn, the density is increasing. And the blue is the open porosity, which is the porosity that is interconnected with other pores as well as connected to the atmosphere. And the green is the closed porosity. So those are pores that are occluded or trapped from the atmosphere. You can see there's some depth, we call it the bubble close off depth, at which the bubbles of air become more and more occluded, and eventually there's a depth which all the porosity is occluded from the atmosphere and bubbles of air are trapped, and that's what you eventually will measure in your ice core. So why do we even care about this? It turns out because the Firn is porous, and the air can freely move throughout the Firn matrix, so this is just a cartoon of what Firn might look like. The air that is deep in the Firn is still relatively young compared to the surrounding ice because of diffusion processes. So maybe on the order of a decade or so. But the Firn itself is quite old, hundreds to thousands of years perhaps, because it represents how long it takes to accumulate 100 meters of snow. So because that age difference is called delta age, the difference in age between the ice and the air trapped within. And we need to know what delta age is to get the chronology correct for ice cores. So the figure on the right here is from the Neem ice core, which was drilled in northern Greenland about a decade ago. And on the top are the water isotopes, so that's the proxy for temperature. And on the bottom is the methane. And so if we want to get to the chronology correct, that is the lead and the lag between temperature changes and atmospheric changes, you need to know the delta age. And I'll say as the ice core records are getting to be higher and higher resolution temporally, it becomes more and more important to know delta age very accurately and precisely. And so one way we can figure out delta age is to use a Firn density model to get the Firn age and a Firn air model to get the gas age. And there's some other ways as well, but I'm a Firn modeler, so I'll tell you that that's the way that I would do it. So I'm going to shift now for the rest of my talk to talk about the temperature records we get from ice cores, and in particular water isotope diffusion. So as I said before, delta 18O, the water isotope, is a proxy for the site temperature. And that means that snow that falls in summer is warmer, so it has a higher delta 18O value expressed in per mil. And in the winter, the snow is colder, so a lower delta 18O value. So that's shown over here in this figure. Here in the summer, the snow is warm with high delta 18O, and vice versa in the winter. And it turns out because the Firn is porous, those water isotopes diffuse as the Firn is advected downward. So this is from a model run I did, a simple experiment. And so I forced the model at the surface with a sine wave of water isotopes. And so near the surface, you have a pretty clear seasonal cycle in your water isotopes. And as you go deeper, because of diffusion, the seasonal cycle is still there, but it is considerably damped. The amplitude is much smaller. So that's called isotope diffusion. And this can be complicated by a number of processes. And one of which I've been looking into recently with some collaborators is how the seasonality of accumulation affects that water isotope signal that you would observe in your ice core. So the blue in this figure is what I showed on the last slide, but for the orange, I switched the accumulation so that we get more snow in the winter than in the summer. And this was for Antarctica, so the months or the seasons are swapped, but the concept is the same. And so we get something like 1.5 times as much snow in the winter as in the summer in the simulation. And you can see simply by changing when the accumulation falls, the value that we observe in the ice core is less than if the snow fell in an equal amount throughout each month of the year. And so if we actually apply that to some ice core data, this is from a study I helped Abby Hughes, who's at the University of Colorado Boulder, with, and this is data from the Greenland Ice Core. And this is the actual water isotope data from that ice core. And there's a high enough accumulation rate at that site that she could actually pick out summer and winter layers in the ice core, and then use a technique to back diffuse the data, so you can get a good estimate of what the isotope values were at the surface when that snow fell by this back diffusion process. But the question that Abby had for me to help her with was, after you back diffuse, potentially could any signal you see in these water isotope data just be due to changing patterns of accumulation? And so here are her back diffuse data. So this is what she thinks the snow looked like when it fell. And I'll draw your attention to B and C here. The red is her summer values, and it's 2,500 years ago to present. So the time is going backwards from what a lot of us are used to seeing, but present here on the left. And the blue is the winter. You can see that over the 2,500 years, the summer isotope values stayed more or less constant with some amount of variability, but there's a distinctive trend in the winter data that the isotopes have been decreasing. So I did some simulations for her with my isotope diffusion model, and I ran 5 scenarios of accumulation. One, I take the annual accumulation and just split it evenly throughout the months, and then I add some noise to that data, and then I say, okay, what if we have something like 3 times as much in the winter as the summer, and vice versa, and run these scenarios. And so the solid lines are the mean values that you would get with those different scenarios. So you can see for the summer, we have a spread of something like 0.8 per mil, and in the winter, maybe 0.6 or 0.7 per mil, which then when we go back to the data, the signal that we observe, or that Abby observed in the winter, is certainly bigger than we would expect from any sort of seasonality in accumulation. So that is interpreted as an actual climate signal on the millennial scale. And then on the centennial scale, you can see perhaps these spikes in the summer here. Potentially that could be a climate signal, but you can't rule out that that could just be due to seasonality of accumulation and Firn diffusion processes. So that's more or less what I wanted to get through, and that was a lot that I said too quickly. I kind of bounced around, but I'm happy to take questions and discuss Firn, and I think it's probably easier if we have an open discussion rather than me spewing more information at you. So thanks for listening.
Okay, any questions for Max?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Max. Yeah, you showed that that in the last slide that you showed your simulations. I couldn't quite get the lines that you show. Are you looking at the range that those lines cover in terms of that would be the maximum you could expect from isotope diffusion? Is that those solid lines look like they're different simulations?
I was muted. Classic. Yeah, so the lines are, you see here that this is a century. And so the line is the mean value for each simulation over that century. And then the dots are the range. And so
So, I mean, when you talk about what could be a result of the signal, what kind of signal could be a result of just say the accumulation shifting across seasons? Are you referring to like the range you cover, or are you referring to like the range those medium or mean lines cover?
You'd actually have to ask Abby exactly how she interpreted this. And this is where my failings come as a modeler, that I'm very happy to take inputs people give me and send them back and tell them, interpret them. But I think because this is centennial scale, taking the mean is a reasonable thing to do, to say between the green and the black is kind of the maximum mean signal that you would see with some sort of reasonable change, physically reasonable change in the accumulation rate. You know, there's a point at which you can say that, well, the accumulation rate won't go to 100% in the winter, perhaps, or something like that for this scenario. So I think on this century scale, by looking at the range between the mean, kind of gives you an idea of how much potential variability you could expect on a century scale. I believe that's how she interpreted it.
Right.
But I was racking my brain throughout this morning trying to remember the conversations we had about this a year ago.
I mean, it seems to me like the experiment was set up as to answer the question of, you know, given the knob of timing of seasonal, you know, the seasonality of accumulation, given that knob and the range that you can reasonably turn it, how much of the wiggle variation from the longer ice core record could you explain and attribute to that seasonal accumulation without invoking some longer term climate change? That's how I interpreted what you presented, which is a really important sort of physical process to isolate in order to correctly interpret those longer term records and really identify and kind of constrain a bigger thump. You have to rule out these other processes. And it reminded me, I put this really convoluted comment into the chat, which I'll send now, of other work being done elsewhere on the ice sheet that has done sort of run similar experiments to isolate other processes that affect the Firn structure. And in that case, it's not so much ice core interpretation, it's water storage in the Firn pore space. But I agree, there's a lot going on in Firn, and it's important to acknowledge all of those processes for correct ice core interpretation and other scientific applications. But thank you, Max, that was great. And Jen, if you want to insert any comments to transition, I heard somebody else, but I don't want to take up Murat's time. Go ahead, Max.
I'll just respond to Murat. One more thing that I didn't mention during this is the back diffusion process relies on the assumption that the accumulation is evenly distributed throughout the year. So that, I guess, is the motivation behind this, is testing that assumption as well.
I see. Okay.
Thanks, Max. I think we'll still have some time at the end too to further the discussion. And as you guys can see, we structured this so we went from the contemporary atmospheric measurements of water vapor isotopes in real time to talking about the transitions that occur in the snow firn. And so now we're going to move over to Murat, who will talk to us about ice cores.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Sure.
Let me share my screen. And can I? All right.
Looks good.
Are we good? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, it's actually great to be talking after Max's talk, because I'm going to talk about the gases, specifically a couple of gases that we're actually actively measuring right now in the lab, carbon sulfide and acetylene, from the Greenland, from the GIS2D ice core from Greenland. Before I start my talk, I'd like to acknowledge, I mean, this is not work I'm just doing on my own. I mean, I work very closely with Eric Saltzman here in Irvine. We've been thinking about this kind of trace gas work in ice cores for a couple of decades now, and Mindy Neiswanger, who is at NOAA right now, a postdoc, she's a grad student. She put in a lot of effort into the measurements you're going to see, and Jennifer Campos Ayala is another grad student. She's a current grad student. She's actually in the lab making measurements as we speak. Okay, so polar ice sheets preserve an archive of ancient atmosphere. Max already covered that. You're seeing a newly drilled ice core here. We drill ice cores to actually access that archive, and that ice cores contain air. This is just small sample that you can see you can see it's a very bubbly ice. It's a shallow ice, so you can see the bubbles clearly. And we either melt or we shred them under cold or sublimate. There's multiple ways of liberating this air. What you see here in the video, short video, is actually a nice piece of ice that's melting, as you see the bubbles coming out. So that's what we're interested in. We want to get that air and make measurements of ultra-trace level gases and hopefully reconstruct composition of the atmosphere in the past. You already know this. I mean, ice cores are really good because we're not talking about a proxy. We're actually talking about recovering a sample from the old atmosphere when it comes to ice cores. So I think that's one of the biggest values of ice cores as an environmental archive. Obviously, in addition to just learning the atmospheric composition, what do we do with that information? We can infer information about sources and removal processes that control the atmospheric levels of these gases that we measure. So we call this the biogeochemistry, generally speaking, of ice core gas work. At UCI, we target more reactive, shorter-lived gases, so not like methane and CO2. Those are the commonly taught about gas records. So carbonyl sulfide and acetylene. I'm showing you what these gases are like. COS is essentially an oxygen, carbon, and sulfur. It's a linear molecule. Acetylene is a non-methane hydrocarbon. It's also a linear molecule. They're a little different. I call them short-lived, but COS is not technically a short-lived gas. It's like right at the boundary. Its atmospheric lifetime is about a year, which is on par with the inner hemispheric mixing timescale in the atmosphere between the northern and southern hemispheres. Acetylene is a short-lived gas in a real sense. Its lifetime is about a couple of weeks. So a little information about these two gases. COS is the most abundant sulfur gas in the troposphere, even though it's a trace gas, and its mixing ratio is only 500 parts per trillion or so on a global average basis. It's a climate active gas. It's a major source of background sulfate aerosol in the stratosphere. And its largest sources today are oceanic emissions and anthropogenic emissions. And there's also some COS being emitted from biomass burning. A lot of the interest today on COS results from its most dominant sink, which is the terrestrial uptake. Terrestrial plants, especially during photosynthesis, they take up COS alongside CO2 and do not respire it back. So that makes it potentially a very valuable tracer of gross primary productivity of land biosphere. And there's also a little bit of oxidation by OH in the atmosphere that takes away some of the atmospheric COS. For acetylene, incomplete combustion is the only known source, and OH oxidation is the only known sink. So that's quite simple. I mean, so where do we have incomplete combustion? Obviously, burning, anything that's burning emits acetylene, especially biomass and biofuel burning. There's a lot of acetylene being emitted. In terms of anthropogenic sources, car exhaust is one of the primary sources of atmospheric acetylene, and any other form of fossil fuel burning that doesn't result in perfect burning. And like I said, oxidation in the atmosphere, oxidation by OH in the atmosphere is only known source. So it has a fairly simple biogeochemistry. So if you think about the pre-industrial atmosphere, so we get rid of the anthropogenic influences. If you think about acetylene, it ends up becoming a balance between biomass burning and oxidation by OH. And biomass burning obviously is an important biogeochemical process that emits all sorts of trace gases plus a source of aerosols and whatnot. So we really want to know about burning changes in biomass burning in the past. And the shorter lifetime of acetylene means the Greenland acetylene measurements or acetylene measurements from Greenland ice cores will be especially sensitive to fires either in the Arctic or around the Arctic disproportionately. So in a global sense, tropical fires are actually where most of the fires happen today. For COS, if we get rid of the anthropogenic component, we're looking at a little different balance. This is a very different trace gas. It's basically a balance between primarily oceanic emissions with some addition from biomass burning, balanced by uptake by the terrestrial biosphere. So there's very little information about either the oceanic sources of trace gases versus gross primary productivity variability in the past. So we think that it could be a very valuable paleo proxy for these biogeochemical processes. Okay, so a little bit about why we need measurements from both hemispheres. You probably guessed that already a little bit. I mean, today, most of the existing ice core COS and SLE measurements are from our lab, but they've come from Antarctic ice cores. We recently are trying to focus on the Greenland ice cores. And we need that because short-lived gases can display large interpolar interhemispheric differences. And there's actually very valuable information in that interhemispheric or interpolar difference. Obviously, once we get to data, I'm showing you a map of here, like this. We have Greenland here, Antarctica here. What we're interested in usually is a global picture, right? We make the observations from the ice sheets out of necessity, but we want global inference. And for that, oftentimes we rely heavily on modeling, especially in the case of acetylene. Okay, now I'm going to show you some data that we have. So I should mention all the Greenland data are still preliminary. So this is COS. This graph is, all the other graphs will be the same. The x-axis, the time is going from left to right, past to present. The time is in kilo years, basically 1,000 years before calendar year 1950. I'm showing you data from the red markers like Greenland, and the blue and the green ones are from Antarctica. So we only have good data for the last 1,000 years for COS right now. And I'm also showing the present day global mean at about 500 ppt on the top, that shaded the light green shade. So you can tell that COS is mostly lower over Greenland than Antarctica. And this was expected because more of the oceans obviously are in the southern hemisphere, and more of the land, which is the sink, is in the northern hemisphere. All ice core data from both south and north are plotting like 30 to 50% lower than present day mixing ratios. In my opinion, I think this is the strongest observational constraint we have on the strength of anthropogenic emissions on the budget atmospheric burden of this gas today. And there is some changes in the interhemispheric difference. If you look at it, like the Antarctic and Greenland seem to come together between 600 and 400 years, sorry, not 1,000, 400 years ago, versus the periods before and after that. So there's some interesting information there. We did not start the official interpretation of this data yet. I mean, our long-term goal is to create a Northern Hemisphere record that complements the data we have from Antarctica. I'm showing you the last 8,000 years now. This is the Antarctic Ice Core record we have from South Pole, 2 different locations in Antarctica. We actually have more data, but these are the best data sets we have. So we hope to learn about the changes in the hemispheric gradient and hopefully get some inference on what GPP could be doing. And we have we are already allocated the ice. We just have some delays currently due to the ongoing pandemic, actually getting the ice from the rest of the Holocene to complete this analysis. But I'm hoping, and we're all hoping, that situation will be resolved soon. So now on to acetylene. So again, this is the same plot. I'm showing you the South Pole Antarctica data is the lower measurements. And the Greenland data is higher up. You can see the much larger interhemispheric gradient than COS between Greenland and Antarctic data. So this here, the Greenland red points are Greenland data. The purplish ones are South Pole Antarctica. The other couple of things to notice here, the Greenland acetylene measurements are mostly below the present day Northern Hemisphere mean. And this is not Arctic mean, Northern Hemisphere mean, while well, in the South, the situation is a little different. I mean, this is without getting into too much detail. This basically points to a global distribution of fires that we think is quite different than what we have today. Obviously, through some modeling, we have to account for what the anthropogenic sources did and all that. On a larger scale, we have some acetylene data, especially from Antarctica, going way back to 25,000 years before present. We're trying to get the Greenland record basically up to speed, but you can see we are seeing very large, potentially very large changes in the interpolar difference for atmospheric acetylene. There's like some really interesting information, really exciting inferences you can draw from that, like what are the drivers of biomass burning in high latitudes and how do they impact acetylene levels over Greenland. So this is the kind of stuff we're thinking about. And my final slide, I'm just gonna move away just slightly from the gases maybe, but point out a couple of synergies and needs in terms of ice core work and what's going on in the Arctic. I think Greenland and other glacier sites in the Arctic are obviously extremely valuable environmental archives of both precipitation, like Jeff and Max pointed out, and also the atmosphere. And the information we've recovered have global implications, but are also closely linked to some local environmental concerns. Like if you think about the climate change, the ice sheet mass loss and sea level rise, and how all the impacts of climate change is amplified in the Arctic region. Interpretation of the ice core data, not just the gases, all the data, requires accurate characterization of all environmental factors that influence the glaciers today. And then we have to think about how they may have influenced things in the past. So in that sense, I think modeling efforts should focus just as much on what's coming into the Arctic instead of just what's happening in the Arctic region. And specifically, for example, the wildfire records we hope to receive, and I think we are getting from Greenland Ice Cores, will tell us about what information about fires in the high latitude Northern Hemisphere, including the Arctic, which can provide, in my opinion, an insight into the history of human activities in and around the Arctic. And my last comment here is a little bit of going towards the social science direction. I think there's also an interesting synergy here. Just as we can provide some information to them, I think we can also use some information from that aspect, that is interpretation of the data we're basically hoping to recover. We'll also rely on somewhat on what we know about the history of human activity in high northern latitudes, simply because humans, through especially fires, I think is one of the most important mechanisms we do that with. We impact the environment a lot through our actions. And so it would be good to know, basically, essentially, I need to learn more about human activities around the Arctic is what I'm getting at. And then basically, that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Murat. That was really great. And this slide is actually an excellent, I think, transition into our conversation here in the last couple of minutes, because I was going to come back and ask sort of what's needed from the perspective of the three of you and the way we structured today's talks with going from contemporary measurements in the atmosphere into the snow firn and the transformation that takes place there, and then to analyzing the historic records in the ice cores. Now that the three of you have sort of seen each other's presentations and stuff, I'm really curious, like, you know, if you had either of you, Max or Murat, had a crystal ball and stuff, and you could tell somebody like Jeff, like, what do they need to be measuring? Or Jeff, what you could flip that question around even and say, so I'm curious there, and I'm sort of taking a step back and asking like the program manager question, right? So I'll stop there and let any of you can kind of chime in on that one.
Should I go? Yeah, so I mean, I think as an ice core scientist, we're basically interested in anything that comes and falls on the ice sheet, and obviously not just Greenland ice sheet, but I try to put it in there. We're also in there a few sites in terms of for gas perspective and for chemistry, ice chemistry, and especially the Denali Park in Alaska that are of high interest. We're interested in anything that falls on the ice sheet or influences, especially in terms of the gas composition. And in terms of short-lived gases, that could be meteorology, because sometimes we see changes in gases and we don't quite know how to tease apart. I mean, there's a lot of, for example, for acetylene, it's not clear whether the emissions changed or the transport processes changed, or simply where the emission is happening, like the location of the emissions. There's this multiple ways you can go about interpretation of the data. And the present day measurements of, for example, linking gas measurements from Summit Station, which I know are happening. They sometimes on and off. I mean, NOAA had some flash networks and whatnot. I think there's like ongoing in situ measurements. So it's covering gases and anything else from Greenland and other sites, then, and how they respond to changes in meteorology on a seasonal scale, interannual scale, on a decadal scale. There could be, longer term changes if that's the kind of information we need to help us guide. There is facilitate the better interpretation, and also location. I'm also a little worried, especially about the fires. Where do fires happen, and they may have disproportionate impact on, because our observation is from a static perspective. How does like the fires happening, say in the Canadian Arctic versus Siberian Arctic, like what is the imprint of that will be in terms, not just in terms of short-lived gases, but also aerosols, like in terms of ice chemistry. That's the kind of stuff of interest. So let me stop my sharing, sorry. Okay.
Well, I think I thank you for that presentation, and I think again this is one of the efforts that some of the different groups and networks are making in terms of trying to monitor, for instance, questions about black carbon and these measurements that are taking place associated with these fires. We just sat here in Anchorage last summer, and we were sucking Siberian smoke for a week or two. So there was this real kind of zonal transport that was going on. And I think that one of the, as you're asking about fires and deposition of these particulates, there are lots of tools that would allow one to, for instance, use back trajectory analyses. So that's one of the things we do with the water vapor isotopes is, we're quite interested in these kind of sources and sinks of water. So we can use back trajectories for like the last 5 days. So when literally do this here, for instance, in Anchorage or in Thule or in these other places, so that we can really kind of fingerprint those sources and how they actually are manifested in time. And so whether it's particulates in the snow or having stations across, different parts of the Greenland ice sheet so that you can collect snow samples, for instance, and use these back trajectories to talk about variability in the sources of those fires.
Thanks, Jeff. Max, did you want to respond to that at all?
I think both of you just kind of nailed what my interest just keeps coming back to, and this is both in the ice core and the altimetry communities of spatial variability is a huge question. And we have these giant ice sheets, and we get these point measurements and have to make interpretations from them. And by all means we should, because it's what we have available. But I think there are a lot of outstanding questions that digging into the spatial variability. And on the Firn question, I guess really it comes down to accumulation of where is snow falling and when, and how does that interpret or affect our interpretations, both out of ice cores, but then also with the altimetry record of small scale changes. Because really, I mean, it's phenomenal, but we're getting into a realm here. What I was talking about with Abby's work there, that it's sub-annual resolution from an ice core so to be able to interpret or to trust those measurements, there are other process-based questions that you need to dive into, such as like, okay, well, all of a sudden the Firn matters in a way that we didn't realize it did before in order to believe these sub-annual measurements. So.
Well, and that's one of the places I think, that we're quite interested in hoping to work more is, because of, we can collect these kind of continuous measurements of the water vapor isotopes and track those in terms of what their sources are, that understanding, for instance, whether or not moisture is coming off an open Baffin Bay up onto the ice sheet, for instance, is isotopically distinct from time periods when it's ice covered. And the wind trajectory hasn't changed, but the sea ice conditions have changed dramatically. And so these and again, I'm also, thinking about that site over on the east there where you're showing today, that eastern core site that was published there, that Abigail, that's a really interesting site because potentially it's got unlimited moisture source coming off that kind of Greenland Sea area. But then when that all locks down, as the sea pack ice kind of comes along that eastern shore and the wind trajectory starts changing and moving around, the moisture source could be changing quite a bit between summer and winter. So this is one of the places where we feel like these kind of more continuous high definition measurements that allow us to understand sources, trajectories, amounts can really help us as we go back into these ice core records and kind of look at this variability at these finer scales and what is that telling us about, for instance, the kind of surrounding sea ice conditions and transport.
So one other aspect of Firn I didn't mention during the talk, and we don't have a biologist or anything among us either, but another aspect of Firn is just like the isotopes in the gas community, we're always interested in potential processes that can alter the composition of the gas, right? So the gases we measure are at very low levels. We're talking about low parts per trillion levels. So anything that happens in the process, chemistry or biology, that changes the composition of the air can lead to erroneous interpretations. Like you may think that atmosphere changed like that, but you may actually be looking at a chemical process that happens in the Firn, for example. There's been examples of that in terms of ice meltwater chemistry. So in that regard, one of the things I'm worried about is actually, we've seen some examples. We looked at some samples from the last glacial period. I didn't get into it for COS from Antarctic samples. When the dust levels, when the ice impurity levels are much higher than today. And obviously between Greenland and Antarctica, one of the differences, Greenland is closer to land masses and there's more impurity in the ice, right? So impurity driven in situ production. And I have suspicions that this could actually be happening in the Firn. A lot of people talk about this as if production after the bubbles getting closed in the ice, but I think it could be happening in the Firn. That's one area that I think in the Firn community that first we need to characterize, I think, more impurities in addition to just the chemistry we measure. I don't know if anyone's looking at if there are any pollens or spores and bacteria and viruses and that kind of, I really would like to see some research get going on that kind of stuff. And then perhaps we could go from there. Anyway, just wanted to say the isotope, that the whole seasonality, how it can impact what you're recording is we have similar issues on the gases front that we're thinking about that, might impact what what we're seeing.
Thanks. So we're past the top of the hour. I just want to maybe give the opportunity if anybody has maybe one more burning question or something, they could ask it, and then we probably should close out the call. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask? This is a great conversation. I feel like we could go on for another half an hour with you guys because it was a really fun, I think, seminar to structure to thinking about the physical space that we were looking at. So any last questions? Does anybody have something they'd like to ask? Okay, if not, well, thanks to all three of you for the great talks and the great discussion. Again, like I said, this was fun to put together for our teams. I know my teammates, both from the Glacier team and the Atmosphere team, spent a lot of time thinking about the right speakers to bring together and structure this. So I appreciate you taking the time today to be with us. I'm sure your talks will be viewed online in the future where they'll live forever. So people will come back and they'll answer your questions, or they'll have everything we need, right, in 10 years, and it'll be really interesting to look at the archives. But yeah, thanks for taking the time to be with us. These things do take time. We appreciate it, but it's very valuable to everyone. Hazel, with that, I think the only other thing left on the agenda is just any team member updates or anything else. So I'll turn it back over to you, Hazel, to close us out. Or Meredith, I'm not sure which one of you was actually running this one. Sorry, my bad.
That's all good. Yeah, I thank you all to the presenters. The meeting notes and recording will be posted on the IARPC website. And I think since we are over the top of the hour, I'm not sure what the teams have coming up next, but please sign up for an account on the IARPC website if you haven't already, and stay posted. Both of these teams do really interesting work. So hope to see you at our next meeting.
Thanks, Hazel.